G'day, Pack. I'm here with Straight Back Bowman. We are in the very comfy new Wolfden content studio.
Beautiful, mate. Well done.
Great podcast coming up. Max Presnell, Adam Sparrow. They're both authorities on big betting in the 60s, 70s and 80s in Australia.
The greats, no doubt.
They're very entertaining, this podcast. We talk about the 9 most influential punters / bookies of that era. Really important podcast. I spent a lot of time researching it to do it justice.
Amazing stories I have to tell, that's for sure.
Yep. Other than that, the reason we look ridiculous is because we're working hard on another show that we're going to bring to you. It's a sports variety show, sort of loosely based on those great shows back in the 80s and 90s that Australia used to pump out on a Sunday afternoon that we all used to watch.
They are my favourites, mate. Shaped my youth.
It should be very entertaining. We're working hard on that. We're going to bring it to you probably in about 10 days' time. We'll dump it on YouTube. Other than that, download the Wolfden app. If you want to improve your punting, it's simple. You've got to download the Wolfden app.
Absolutely.
You'll improve your punting, you get good tips, and you become part of an awesome community that's growing really fast. Let's enjoy this podcast. Take us out with an Up the Den, please, Bowman.
Up the den.
All right, welcome, Max Presnell, Adam Sparrow. Thank you for coming in. So,
thank you, Richie.
The idea behind this story is, I was just telling Max, I did an interview with Mark Reed a few weeks back, and people absolutely loved hearing all the stories about the old times. And I thought, well, there's so many more stories from that time to talk about, and it's probably the best era in betting in Australia. We can discuss that in this podcast. And then I thought, well, how can we put as much colour and life to these stories as possible? And I thought of Max straight away. And luckily for me, Adam, you know Max well, called Max, and Max was more than happy to come in and talk with us. So appreciate you coming in, Max. So I asked you, Adam, when we wanted to talk about this period in time, it's such a big period of time and so much happened. And I said to you, let's try and narrow it down to say 10 or so of the most influential punters and stuff of that time. And you came up with 9 names that you said, let's focus on these people, which was, and I'd heard of all of them, which is good. And then luckily for me, there's this book which is called Gentlemen of the Australian Turf, and written by David Hickey, written back in the 80s. But it's actually a very good read, and it sort of paints a portrait of some of these characters really, really well. So I thought what I would do is read a little bit about each of the characters we're going to talk about from this. If they're not in this book, I got some stuff from the internet and stuff.
Yep.
So I'll just read a little bit to introduce these people, and then I'll hand over to you to put a bit more colour, life and story to them all. I think the big point to start with is what you say, Adam, and also what Mark Reed said, is that there was 2 economies back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, right? There was the economy that you had money to bet with, and then there was the economy which was for everyday life. Is that fair to say that it was?
Well, I think people who bet in large amounts of money have a very different idea of money. To bet in those amounts, you can't have a lot of regard for money.
Yeah. And that was a big thing.
To be a professional punter, you can't have a lot of regard for money.
Yeah.
Because you're making decisions and you're putting big amounts on. You're not sitting there thinking, oh, what can I do with this money?
Yep.
So you have to be rather flippant with money. Where a bookmaker's different. So as I say to people about a bookie and a punter, the difference between a bookie and a punter is this. A bookie's happy to go to the races with 20,000 in his bag and happy to win 1,000.
Yeah.
A punter goes to the races with 1,000 and wants to turn it into 20.
True.
That's the different mentality of them.
Yep.
So punters don't have a big value of money, you might say.
And a lot of the people we're going to talk about in this podcast, the only reason they bet was to make more money so they could bet more and bet bigger. Is that fair?
Well, I knew a lot of them. I grew up with them all. I was with my father all the time, and he was very good friends with all of them, and I knew them well. I used to go to the races and watch it. And my take on it through living with my father and living the life myself and knowing these people, they lived very well, but money was really for betting with.
Yeah.
And they won and lost fortunes.
Yeah.
You know, they never thought they'd have massive wins. They could have gone and bought 3 or 4 houses in Coogee Bay Road, because I grew up in Coogee at the time in the 70s, say. And, you know, no, we've got a house. We'll just keep betting with that. You know,
and to put some perspective to how big the betting back was, and your dad was a big player, and you tell the story. What was the most your dad ever won in?
He won £100,000 in a week in 1962, I think it was. Yeah.
So 100,000, and did he go and buy a house?
He went
after
and bought the house which was the family home for 37 years. He paid £7,500 for it.
Right, so he bought a beautiful house in Coogee for £7,500 after winning £100,000.
He could have bought 10 of them. He bought one of them. And I remember my uncle telling me. So I remember when your dad won the money. we speak about it now. He said, "Oh well, I'm not going to bet anymore." He said, "I never have to bet again." He said,
So your dad was Jack Sparrow,
Jack
very well
Sparrow,
known,
very well,
very colourful,
very
one of
well
the
known,
original
very
colourful
colourful,
racing identities.
The
And
last of
he
the
passed
colourful
away, what,
racing.
how many years ago did your dad pass
5
away?
years ago on my birthday. He made sure I didn't forget.
Yeah, and he lived to 95.
94.
Do you want to quickly tell the story in the nursing home when they called you from the nursing home with a complaint
yes,
about
the
it?
nursing home. So he'd been in the nursing home 5 days, and
Yeah.
it was a Saturday morning.
And
He
the
went in on
nursing home up
Monday.
at King's Cross, right?
Yeah,
You went back to where it all started?
Up at, Rushcutters Bay. And I get a phone call, and I remember it was Saturday morning because I was looking through the fields, and they said, "Oh, it's from the nursing home," and I went, "Oh, is my father all right?" I'm thinking they're saying he's dead. He was 92 at this stage, and they said, "Oh no, he's okay." So we just went into his room last night, and we found one of the residents in bed with him. And I burst out laughing. I said, "And?" Well, it's very inappropriate behaviour, they said, and it's not tolerated here. And I said, "Well, it's not inappropriate for him." I said, "Normally they'd have 2 in bed with him." And I'm laughing. She said, "Well, it's not a laughing matter," she said. "Can you have a talk to him and tell him he's not allowed to do it?" I said, "I won't be able to tell him what to do." I said, "No one tells him what to do."
Yeah.
And that was that.
Yeah.
But that was the sort of guy he was. He was
Funny.
guy. Yeah.
All right, well, let's rip into it. So the first punter I want to talk about, so we're going to talk about 9 punters. 9 punters, and one of those is also big betting Bill Waterhouse, who sort of intrinsically fits in with all of them. But anyway, so I'm going to read, and some of the excerpts are a little long, but I think it's important so we really understand what we're talking about. So this first one is about Felipe Ysmael, the Filipino fireball, and it's an excerpt from David Hickey's book. When the Sydney racing journalist Keith Robbins asked Bill Waterhouse to name the biggest punter he had encountered on racetracks around the world, Waterhouse replied, "The babe Felipe Ysmael stands on his own. The babe is not only the biggest punter I have seen, he's the biggest I've even heard about." Felipe Ysmael, the Filipino fireball, was born a member of one of the wealthiest families in the Philippines. He acquired his interest in racing while attending the university in California, but decided it was useless, putting huge amounts on horses through the tote. There are no on-course bookies in the US, and seeing the price shrink accordingly. He tried the United Kingdom for a time, but the bookies there had started to lose their dash as the government continued to raise betting taxes, and he found they could not accommodate his mammoth betting style. He returned to Miller in the mid-1960s and decided to give Australian racing a trial. So we're back so he arrived sort of early 1960s. So how old are you?
Look, no, I was born in 1964. I never met Felipe Ysmael. I'd heard plenty about him, and my father spoke about him, about different things. I don't know. Max would know a lot more about Felipe Ysmael. I know they said he's the biggest punter of all time. That's all I know.
Yeah.
But I didn't know him.
Did you ever meet him, Max?
A few fleeting, you'd say, meetings, just to say hello after a race. But no, he was a will of the wisp.
Yeah.
He wasn't out there like some of the other big punters, big operators. I think a fellow called Frank Ford was his racing manager.
So he owned a lot of horses?
Yes, he owned a lot of horses. He spent a lot of money, become established in Australia. He certainly was a major player, but he was like one of these... At that stage, there were imports. They stood out. I think Romano, who owned Burnborough. When I say imports, I'm talking about people that weren't true blue Australians. They did stand out. They had their own personality. But the fireball had his own staff around him. You couldn't get to him. Like as a journalist, you couldn't get to him. You had to try and get through Frank Ford, who was again his racing manager. But no, he was a big punter. But I don't think any of those blokes would live with Kerry Packer as far as their size and their bets are concerned. But that's a different story. He was a punter, and he did strike trouble too with the authorities. He did time. He was outed.
Yeah, so he got warned off.
Yes, over the running of a horse. But no, he had a spark to the Australian racing scene. There's no doubt about that.
There's a good story here that I'll just quickly read. So, on the 1st of May 1968, Ysmael set racing history at a midweek fixture at Newcastle. A 2-year-old Silver Strike was entered for a lowly maiden race with a first stake of $350. So the first prize for winning the race was $350. Ysmael was not even on the course, but his agent, Frank Ford, who you just talked about, claimed Bill Waterhouse for a single bet of an even $100,000 and was set. Silver Strike started 4-7 and won easily. So the first prize of the race is $350, and the Fireball is having $100,000. Yeah. So that gives you a bit of perspective.
And
on how
100,000. You could have bought
ferociously you bet.
Newcastle for 100,000, then you could have gone and bought the whole suburb.
The point is, in racing in those days, prize money was nothing.
Yeah.
Nobody cared about prize money.
Yeah, so it was all about the punt.
Trainers would wait 6 months to get the right horse in the right race and the right
Bet
price,
and bet, yeah.
and would go to extremes to get it. Now with the Fireball and Bill Waterhouse is like a big game fisherman playing a marlin. He'd play these big punters. Now, if I'd went up to Bill Waterhouse and said, "Bill, can I have 10,000 on this horse? First starter at Newcastle," he'd look at me. He'd say, "Something's wrong about this. This young mug wouldn't be putting 10,000.
Go to someone
and
else.
He's doing it for somebody else. And anyway, I don't like that 10,000. No, you can. How much can I have on? Oh, you got the odds to 200. But with the big players.
Yeah.
Bill would fish.
So he played heads.
He had to let them on. Because
yeah.
they might have gone anywhere. And he knew there was plenty there, plenty to be won, some to be lost. But at the end of the day, he could beat them. That day, the Fireball beat Bill.
Yeah.
But did the Fireball end up on top of Bill? I doubt it very much.
I'm betting $1 million to 1 the Fireball in that contest.
So why don't we keep rolling? Let's talk about Big Bet and Bill Waterhouse. And I've got a little bit of stuff to read about him, once again from the David Hickey book. So William Stanley Waterhouse is Australia's best-known bookie and was for 20 years the biggest. Through other periods as a barrister, business and consular general for the Kingdom of Tonga, but bookmaking remained his forte. So this is a good little story that I'll read, and it just really talks about the psyche that you're talking about of the punter and the bookie and that mental battle. In 1967, Bill Waterhouse flew to Melbourne to field by invitation at Flemington during the Melbourne Cup Carnival. Ysmael and his syndicate had coupled Young Brady and Red Handed months earlier to win $665,000 in the Victoria Derby Melbourne Cup double. Young Brandy started a hot 6-4 favourite in the Derby, but was beaten. On Melbourne Cup Day, it was obvious Ysmael would back Red Handed for a fortune. And this is what Bill Waterhouse said about what happened on that day. "I saw Ysmael coming. He was coming in to claim Red Handed. When he was just a few feet away, I looked him straight in the eye. He stopped in his tracks. He slowly edged his way to my side. Just as he was about to claim me, I reached up to my board and I flipped the price out to 9-2. Ysmael looked aghast. I knew he wanted to bet red-handed, and he knew that I knew. And there I was, giving him half a point better than any other bookmaker on course. With his betting units, that was worth anything from $50,000 to $1 million. You could see him thinking, reacting. He must have thought I was challenging him. He must have thought that I knew something. Straight away, he said, 50,000, 200,000 on general command. I took the bet and he went away. It is history that Red Handed won the 1967 Melbourne Cup, finishing a long way ahead of general command. And then Waterhouse goes on to say, that was the period that Frank Duval to Ysmael for 3 years. I never knocked back a bet. I took everything as it came, but I was years younger then. I would not like to do that again. Interesting about that whole psyche thing, and you feel that sort of the advantage that the Waterhouse family have got these days. You know, they're obviously incredibly hard workers, but they, you know, have a lot of advantage in life, and you feel that possibly that was set up during that period where Bill was just betting massive and took these punters on and won. Yeah.
Well, you'd imagine that the business he did for Felipe Ysmael betting with Bill Waterhouse certainly would have added a lot to the Waterhouse fortune.
Yeah.
He would have lost a lot of money.
Yeah.
Felipe Ysmael.
Yeah.
From what I've heard, he lost fortunes. Yeah.
Anything more to add about Big Bet and Bill Waterhouse?
Oh, where do you start? Where do you want to start? I've got no doubt that I strongly disagree that he was Australia's biggest bookmaker, but I doubt whether there was one as controversial.
Yeah.
When you look at his career, and it was based on big punters, big betting, but when you look over his career, he was outed, he was involved in fine cotton. By gee, you know, he did supply headlines.
They were
was
always
a major player.
The racing authorities were always trying to get rid of him, weren't they?
No, well, like Bill was always, he was playing the edges. Like, you know, so always trying to get rid of him. When you look at the massive turnover tax that Bill Waterhouse would have played, I don't think they would have been trying to get rid of him.
Yeah.
Because don't forget all these big bets, like the racing industry, the AJC, the VRC, they got their piece of the action. And for what? Just having him stand up. He was taking the risk. So I don't think they're trying to get rid of him. But then again, the AJC and the VRC, they're very puritanical. Bill, like when you look at Bill's record, There's a few dark marks there. They treated him with extreme caution. And on reflection, I think they're entitled to. What do you think?
Well, when I started working for Robbie in 1980, his son, I love Robbie, he's a great guy. Bill was like the king of the racecourse. He was. He'd stand up there and
Smoking?
no, I don't think he was smoking there, but I remember when I was younger being at the races in the 70s, he never had a cigarette out of his mouth. I think by the time 1980, he might have given them away. But when I was a little boy, he'd never have one out of his mouth.
And he still lived to 95 or something, even after smoking.
97, I think.
97 was he? Well.
But what I was going to say, but it was like it was his kingdom. Would you agree with that, Max? He sort of like look over it, and no one ever said anything out of school to him, like everyone had abused bookies for some reason, they don't bet him enough. No one ever said it to Bill.
He was a very imposing figure.
He was an
But
imposing
the
figure.
betting ring then was full of imposing figures.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say there was one more imposing, but when I think of Arthur Browning, I can go back.
Lovely
there.
man.
They were very imposing figures.
He's
but
a
the
big
thing
man,
that
Arthur
always
Browning,
struck me about Waterhouse was the way he could write betting tickets. Now, we'd have a big stack of betting
Yeah.
tickets, and big, and he'd be right. And we're not talking about, we're not talking
Very good
about
at it,
50 or 60 a day. We're talking about 100 a race.
Yeah,
Try
yeah.
doing it. Now, I wouldn't say the printing, you could understand it.
No, that wasn't. They weren't.
But
they
the
weren't very
business
clear
was so
printing.
intense that he was just, and you can't imagine 40, 50 people around this stand, and with Bill Waterhouse
what it was
writing
like,
these
yeah.
tickets.
Great theatre.
And then the clerks trying to take it. And the whole thing.
And then
it
someone's
was
penciling
just-
too,
you've got-
writing it all down.
And you've got no idea. And trying to keep.
The pencilers are amazing.
Adam, you know more about it than I do. But
Well, I used to write 'em for Robbie.
Adding them up and keeping tallies with this machine.
Yeah.
Just
And it's all in the head too, no
Well,
computers.
the most important one is the bagman. And when I worked for Robbie, and this is in 1980, I remember the day I was on the ground, he said, Adam, and he just gave me the tickets, and I'm 16, right? And I turned 16 in January, I was working there in May, so I'm not even 16 and a half. Adam, write tickets. And in those days, the betting ring was full, and Robbie was in the outer. And it was my first day I remember was at Rose Hill, and there was a big crowd in the outer. And of course, Robbie was the glamour bookie. You'd have 40 people, honestly, from the moment the prices went up, just non-stop.
Yeah.
And the bagman was a guy called Vince Murphy, the brother of Chris Murphy, the lawyer. And Vince Murphy was incredible. He would blokes would come up on $35 on horse at 11 to 8 and things like that. And he'd just go, well, I've got to think about what it is, you know, 47 and after 35, blah, blah, blah. So and so. And it was like monotone, and I'd have to add it together and put the total on the thing with the
Human
initials of the
calculator
horse,
he was.
and I'd yell out the last two numbers, 69, ticket 70. But the most important guy is the bagman because he's calling the bet out. Then the clerk has to write it down.
It's
Not
the
like
bag-
with a machine now. And then, of course, the easiest job was probably mine, writing the ticket. All I'd do was add it together and put the initials of the horse and call the last two numbers. Boom. But Vince Murphy, he was a good... And I think Gary Brown, who was a good fellow, he was Bill's bagman then. And before that was the other bloke. What was his name? The big bloke. No, you'd remember him.
But
He was a good bagman
there was a little
too.
urn there, like, for the other side of the bookmaker's bag. Like, he was there putting the money in, but we were on the other side, like, trying to get an urn out of it. But there was a little go that because Bill Waterhouse wrote so fast and they were taking so many bets down, it was humanly impossible. But whether it was Vince Murphy or some other being to get them all in the book.
Yeah.
So if you had a little bet, let's say 10, 20, 30, 40, $40, you'd go up and you'd say $80. They wouldn't have it in the book. And because there were so many, they might have had it there.
Yeah.
But there was nothing to signify on the card. You couldn't get too desperate.
Yeah.
And say your $20 result. Oh no, that's 200 there. And as long as you went a little bit small, and just said no, that's $40, not $20. They wouldn't go to the trouble of questioning it.
Yeah.
Because then you'd have to go to betting supervisors. You'd have to go to the whole business, and of course you couldn't do it too often.
Yeah.
But it was renowned amongst the desperates. Fortunately, I wasn't one. That you could, you could get a little earn that way. But it was every man for himself on the race course. It was a great place to be.
Yeah.
Great education, and I wouldn't have had it any other way.
Yeah.
Just a footnote on that. There was a guy that used to go around the carnivals, and what he'd do, someone would have 6,000 to 4,000 a horse, say. He'd come straight and over the top and have 6,000 to 60 to 40 it with the next ticket. He must have had a little printing kit, and he changed the last number from a 9 to an 8, and he put the extra 2 noughts on instead of being 100 on the ticket to 10,000 on the ticket. And if the horse won, he'd be first there to collect it.
Right.
Do you remember this bloke? It hit
I
the
remember
paper.
by reputation. I did.
And I tell you something, my dad said to me one day, he found out, he jerried who he was. He said, I see this bloke everywhere. And it's always in the paper the next day how a book he got done for 10,000. He didn't really know, but he wondered what he was doing. And he see people at the races, they're up to something. And my dad could tell that.
Yeah.
But this guy used to travel around, and I think he got Sid Hill, who was a very dear friend of my dad's.
in Melbourne.
He got Sid Hill.
Yeah.
But that's what he'd do. He'd change the last number of the ticket. He must have had some little printing kit or whatever he did. And after Sid got done, my dad said, I think it must have been that bloke. He said, he saw him near the stand before.
Almost like an emu.
Yeah.
Racecourse emu.
A bit better than that, bit different to that. But anyway, that's...
Because Bill Waterhouse worked with Tom late in his life, and I didn't have a whole lot to do with him, but we used to bet with Tom because it was Tom and Bill Waterhouse. And the only funny thing that ever happened with me and Bill Waterhouse is, this is probably 20 years ago, I was out at the track putting money on for Sean and Kingsley. And Sean called me one day and somehow we started talking about Bill, and I just said, he just sort of stands around all day. You can tell he wishes he was betting so much bigger because Tom, of course, everything's changed. So Tom bets you what he had to bet you to win 1,000 or 2, the minimum bet limit every time. And then one day Sean said, let's have some fun. When Tom goes to the toilet, go up to Bill and ask him for 100,000 on a horse and see what happens. So I was just watching their stand, and then I see Tom leave to go to the toilet, and I call Sean to go, righto, he's gone to the toilet. He goes, right, to go and try and back the favourite with him in Melbourne. So I walk up to Bill, say, Bill, can I have 100,000 on number 1 in Melbourne, 210 or whatever it was? And Bill says, that's a bet. And the computer operator's like going, and then Bill's like, it's a bet. Anyway, Tom comes out of the toilet and can see that I'm talking to Bill and he's not at the stand. You've never seen Tom run so hard. He's like, and then he's like, what's going on? I said, Bill said he's going to bet us to win 100,000 on this horse. And Tom's like, no. Anyway.
Is that when you kept sending bottles of water over? So
yeah, true.
Drink lots of water.
So that was my experience with Bill, but he would have loved to. He would have, he just loved betting big. He didn't like betting small like Tom used to, but the game was completely different then, and it's sort of what you had to do. So let's move on from...
One last story about Bill.
Sure.
Robbie had to give me some money one day, and he said, can you go over and get it off Dad at Tom's stand? This is when he's over there with Tom. And I went over there. I said, Rob sent me 8,000 or whatever it was. I said, Rob told me to come over and get 8,000. He said, have you got a gun? Well, he was old, but he's still with me. He said, that's the only way you're going to get 8,000 off me if you've got a gun, he said.
We'll move on. Hey, sure. Max, do you want to just pull that's perfect. So we'll move on to Hollywood George Edzer. Going to need your help here, Adam, and yours too, Max. There wasn't a whole lot on him, but there's one excerpt here which is pretty telling about the kind of mentality he had. So this is what he said in 1965, and once again, it's from the Gentleman of the Australian Turf book. I've had 60,000 in the bank on a Friday night and awoke on a Sunday morning with nothing. I'll worry about it on a Sunday morning, but never on a Saturday. Money means nothing to me on a race course. You could say I was a different person. I forgot I had a family. If I have money, I will bet until every penny has gone. So this is, do you want to tell us a bit about who Hollywood George Edzer was? I mean,
You want me to go first?
Yeah.
Well, Hollywood was one of my father's closest friends. Mm-hmm. They were very close, and my father loved him dearly, as did I. I knew him very well because he was in my, he was part of my life since I was a baby, and the rest of his family, very close to me. My father always said he was probably the biggest punter that he saw. And he tells one story where he said Hollywood had a suitcase full of money. And he said a couple of weeks later, he rang me up and said, you got any cash there, Jack? He said, what happened to the suitcase? He said, it's gone. He said it was just full.
Yeah.
In pounds.
Cash.
Pounds days. Yeah. Full of money. But he always looked immaculate.
Yep.
my father used to laugh. They'd go to the races together. He'd get out of the car and he said he'd be combing his hair back in the window, looking in the reflection of the window. He was known, if it rained, he'd walk off. He'd have he wore the most beautiful clothes. If it rained, he'd have a spare set of shoes in the car. He would go to the car and get the other set of shoes and come back in and give the shoes to somebody away. You know, he was just always looked immaculate.
Yep.
But a great person and much loved by all the people that knew him.
And what did he do for business, or was he just a punt?
Punter?
Yeah.
That's all he ever really did. You know,
Did he make a lot of money, or was he?
He won and lost fortunes.
Yeah.
But when I was a kid, I remember he had a beautiful big home in Vaucluse, like a mansion type thing. I remember as a little, very young, and then, you know, so he'd lived the life.
Yeah. What was your experience of him, Max?
Yeah.
Well, he was he would have been one of the most colourful racing personalities of my time. He received the nickname, he came from Newcastle, apparently, and he was up there and he was having a winning streak and this young bloke, and the bookmaker said to him, "Oh, why don't you get out of town? Why don't you go to Hollywood? You'd be better placed there." And the name Hollywood George stuck with him. But he, when I say colourful, by gee, he was good for we journalists, hacks, call us what you will, because he was always making a story. He was, you'd see him stand out
He
like
had
a
a
Hollywood
presence.
star
He had a presence
in a betting ring and would be putting the money on. And, of course, spectacular. He had to take the knock, which is he couldn't pay huge gambling debts. On the Monday, they went into Tattersalls Club and Hollywood said, well, he was tied up with Jack Large, who was one of the big bookmakers at the time, and they could not pay. And it was a story that reverberated all around the racing world, that this huge punter, and he could not pay. Front page everywhere. And, of course, there was also the story when Hollywood got shot.
Yeah, so was he a bit murky? Like, did he sort of...
No, he's a colourful racing.
Was he a sort of-
He associated with all the... Well, but you got to remember something. In those days, the gambling, the big punters at the races, they're all mixed up in illegal gambling. There was Sydney's underworld was thriving. Of course, there was an SP bookie on every corner, legal gambling clubs. You know, the thieves were out running amok. There was not much security, so everyone was nicking high quality stuff. And of course, Hollywood being involved in the betting knew all these people. Like, they drink at the Royal Oak Hotel at Double Bay, my father and him, and as a young adult, I used to drink there with them. And, you know, it was like a hub for colourful characters. Everyone was doing something in there. So he knew all of those people without being involved in any of the gambling.
Hey, Adam, what about City Tats? What about the City Tats sting?
I don't know about it.
They're going to overlook it. We won't go there. We won't go to the City Tats sting.
You want Hollywood and Jack to come and haunt me tonight?
Oh,
no, I don't know anything
yes.
about it. I don't know anything about it.
It was something. Hollywood, I reckon you could do a great television series on Hollywood, but you'd have to. I'm sorry.
Do it on them all.
Adam, you would have to put City Tats in it as much because.
So what's the
Well, the
brief
City
thing about
Tats-
City Tats?
well-
What happened? It was a...
City Tats, all the bookies, City Tats, they all had these security lockers there.
Yeah.
And where they
Safe
put all
deposit
this
boxes,
beautiful money, all their black money, beautiful money, which they couldn't declare, which went into
Beautiful, dirty, clean money.
which amounted to thousands and thousands of quid, like when a pound was a pound. Now somebody got access to the master key, and when they went into the locker rooms, the bookies, to get their, just to maybe check their money or put some more in or take a little out, all gone.
Wow.
All gone.
My father had a box there.
All gone. I hope he left it.
I used to go in there a lot.
Money, and of course, the bookies at the end of the day, they had to say, "Oh no, there was only some personal items."
Right.
They couldn't come at just how many millions that went.
Wow.
But,
Did they ever find out who did it?
It was said. Well, it was said that the bloke that had the key used to swim at the Red Leaf Pool, which also was a swimming haunt of our hero, Hollywood George Edser.
Okay.
And it was said that that pool might have come into Hollywood's presence at some time. And, well, it was said, but nothing was ever proven.
Yeah.
However, when Hollywood got shot, his son told me that they had a famous, City Tats was famous for a whip around. Anybody was in trouble, anybody didn't have enough money they'd have the famous City Tats whip around. They'd take it around and the money would be found. Well, apparently, they had a whip around for a hitman from Melbourne to hit Hollywood. Failed.
Yeah.
It was a shot, but it didn't strike the target in the right area. But Hollywood, you had to look. He was a great character of my time, and you'll talk about.
Did you know him?
Waterhouse.
Did you know him personally?
No, I spoke to him a couple of times.
Yeah. So you're a young man. What were you in your 20s or something back?
Yeah, I was in my 20s. But look, they were colourful times.
Yeah.
In many ways, they were great times. They were, as Adam said, they weren't particularly. I think they were better times in some ways, but when I see some of the corruption that came out of it now, and I just wonder about that aspect of it. Yeah. But the innocent people didn't seem to get until other things happened. We won't go into that. But they had nothing to do with racing. But no, it was a swinging town, Sydney.
Yeah,
and
that's
people like Hollywood George, they just added to the colour.
So one of the stories about the safety deposit boxes at City Tats, my father was one of the first people to be challenged by the taxation on being a professional punter in the 60s. And he had a safety deposit box full of money at the time. And the ATO went to City Tats and they demanded my father open the box. Now, this was in the paper. I believe it was front page. Do you remember this story? Yeah. Anyway, my father refused to open the box. He said, I'm not opening it. And they said, we're going to get a court order to make you open it. And they put a seal on it. Well, my father broke the seal, which was really bad.
Yeah.
And took the money out.
Oh. How much money are we talking?
Like £30,000. It's a lot of money. And he went and gave it to his cousin to mine. My cousins, their daughter of his cousin, they said, we remember when your father came round with this big box of money. And anyway, it said punter refuses to open safe. And my father got into terrible trouble with the taxation because of it. Because they tried to make him a professional punter and tax him on that. But my father said he was a door. It wasn't pounds, it must have been dollars. Because he said it must have been 1966 or whatever, it turned to dollars. And he said, I'm a door-to-door shoe salesman, I earn $76 a week, blah, blah, blah. I pay tax on that. And he said, so that's what I've won. And he challenged it and won about that side of it. But after that, my father was always terrified of the taxation. That's what he said to me. That's why I never bought any more property, because I couldn't. So him being in trouble with the tax, he should have paid tax and bought more property, would have been better for me.
See, that was the point, though, Adam, that black money.
That's
There
right.
was a lot of black
That's
money
why they kept
around
betting with
that
it,
you could not do anything else with.
Yeah,
It was
except
out
bet
of
with.
pocket money. It was
Yeah.
out
But
of
they
pocket
won it
money.
anyway. But it's
that's why you'll find so many of our colourful personalities won the lottery.
Yeah.
Why, gee, they used to put a lot of money into
well,
it.
they were the,
Yeah, right. Yeah.
so anyway.
We'll keep moving and we'll talk about Joe Taylor. And you mentioned before the gambling houses and where we are. So we're in Surrey Hills right now, and this whole area was where it all happened, wasn't it? Surrey Hills up to King's Cross down to.
Well, Tomo's was always just when I first went to Tomo's, it was just off Oxford Street. I was about 15.
Yeah.
My dad took me in there one up when
So
Kenny Carson's had it.
I'll quickly read this thing about Joe Taylor to put a bit of perspective to it all. So Joe Taylor was for nearly 40 years one of the biggest powers behind the scenes of Sydney's illegal gambling rackets. He was one of the hidden people who controlled Tomo's, the legendary two-up school, and he also managed the illegal gambling den and card club, the Carlisle Club, from the mid-1950s. When he was gambling...
in the 70s, by the way.
Sorry?
He was still operating it in the 70s. I remember waiting in the car outside of there when my dad would go and see him.
When Joe Taylor was gambling, money was nothing more than betting ammunition. He gambled at cards, the horses and the greyhounds, and once said that if he ever found himself with $500,000 cash, he would love to bet it all on a horse. He held a fervent belief that the shorter the price of a horse, the more you put on. And I'll just quickly read about what Big Bet and Bill Waterhouse said about Joe Taylor. Bill Waterhouse, reputedly the world's biggest bookie at the time, once said, "I don't really fear any punter, but if I could fear one, it would be Joe Taylor." Waterhouse explained, "The trouble with Joe is he is one of the few men in the world who completely doesn't give a fuck about money. He can back a few winners, get you on the hook for about 150,000, and he won't come and collect it. He'd rather leave it with you and bet up to it. With a gambler like Joe, they can be very dangerous. He could run into $1 million or more. If the Bank of England was his bookmaker, there would be times that the bank would have been terrified." Following his this is talking more about Joe Taylor. Following his motto that money was for backing horses, he would generally plunge everything on his fancy in the last race of the day. It meant he had to pick the last winner to walk off the course winning, and he would then back up that night at the trots or the dogs. So that's Joe Taylor. He was before your time, Adam. Yeah?
Well, he died when I was 12, but my father was very close with him, and my father adored him. Everybody loved Joe Taylor. He was the most loved person I've ever heard of in my life by people.
Do you agree with that, Max? Was he well loved?
Oh, there's no doubt.
Everyone loved him.
But everybody loved him. Yeah. But he was the biggest giver. Yeah. I reckon he kept the punting poor in Sydney that solvent. It would have fed Bangladesh for a year. Yeah. But Joe was an incredibly generous man. Yeah. And whatever he won, he'd give away. That was the remarkable part about Joe. I can't think of. We've had a lot of colourful, and in Joe's business, which was illegal gambling, was the game, was the tour. But nobody could get near Joe for his generosity. And
he never said no to anyone.
Not only to battling punters, but to charities and everything else. And if he won a squillion, but no doubt he'd give a squillion away.
Yeah.
But he was an incredible man in that way. Well, he was the go-between, you could say, the politicians and the game.
Yeah.
He was the man. And he was the most powerful bloke in Sydney by a mile.
They let the games run, didn't they?
Yes, they let the games. But apart from that, which, let the games, he could get to big people in big places. Now, for instance, Sir Frank Packer, if you think Kerry Packer was a formidable man, you should have seen Sir Frank.
Yeah.
He was a heavyweight with big black glasses. But Sir Frank's wife became very ill. They wanted to get some illegal stuff to treat her, which she couldn't get here. And David McNichol, who was Frank Packer's lieutenant, editor of his papers, approached Joe. He said, Joe, can you do... And this is in David McNichol's book, so I'm not letting anything out of the bag. He said, can you get some of this stuff? And Joe said, I'm not in that business. But he said, look, Sir Frank's wife, she's in pain. That's why we're okay. Well, he was going... they were going abroad, and according to McNichol, Joe arrived with a package and said, there you are. And the business was done, and you would never find a critical word about the game or Joe Taylor in a Packer newspaper. Now, that was a big start. That was a big start.
That's
now,
interesting.
No harm was done to anybody, but that's the sort of man that Joe was. He was a wheeler, a dealer. He worked between the game and the law and the politicians, everything. But nobody, Adam, had a bad word.
No, everyone loved him.
Had a bad word to say about
Did you go to the clubs and stuff? Would you go and bet there? And
well, was the Golden Nugget one of Joe's? The goal? Well, you would be too young. Unfortunately, you're too young for the
I think it might have been. I was, yeah. No, Joe definitely had Carlisle House, because I remember as a little boy, we'd be out for dinner and we'd always stop outside Carlisle.
The Golden Nugget was a place at the crossroads.
And Tom
I used to go there, and he had a wonderful speakeasy up near the railway called the Corinthian Room.
The Celebrity Club was another one. The Celebrity
Club.
before
that.
Yeah.
Celebrity Club's a bit before
your time. That was in the 50s, the Celebrity Club.
I think...
Did you go there to bet, Max, or did you just go because you liked seeing what was going on?
I went to the Corinthian to have a drink after the trots.
Were you a punter, though? Did you bet in the clubs, or that wasn't really your go?
No, I'd go for... It was a social thing with me. I wasn't a gambler with... I liked the tour. But I wasn't a gambler with, the baccarat or anything like that. And after you finish with the races and the trots, and the boats on a Sunday. There wasn't enough
I
time.
got no
The
idea.
boats was
What
Big
does
Benny.
the
The
boats
18
mean?
footers.
And I
You
worked
bet on
for
the
an
18
afternoon-
Oh,
footers
they
on
used
the
to be
harbour.
that big.
And I used to work for an afternoon newspaper, which meant you started early. So no, the games didn't really get me to any great degree.
Yeah.
It's a funny thing. I'll just back up what you were saying about Joe Taylor. Now, my father told me this when I was very young, and Joe Taylor said it to him. He said, more important than keeping the coppers sweet, it's more important to keep the journalists sweet. That's what he said. This is my dad. I remember my dad when I was a little boy, and he said what Joe used to do. He said all of the reporters had come there and the journalists had come to the club. And he said that, and Joe, they all owed Joe. Joe would be giving him handouts all the time. They never said a bad word about him. But Joe was the godfather of Sydney. He was the most powerful man by a mile. They thought Perce Galea was a game runner. That's all Perce was. David Hickey got it wrong, the Prince and the Premier. The man was always Joe, but the press never wrote it about him. He had all the power, the politicians. They had the...
But you never really had... Look, I might have had a drink with Joe. You never really had a...
Well, he didn't drink, I don't think, did he?
No, but I'm saying...
Yeah, you might have.
When
Really, I don't
had
think he
a
drank.
drink, I didn't have to go out to sympathy with him.
Yeah. Now, what I mean is I don't think he
No,
drank.
but I had a drink with... No, he didn't. But
He
I
didn't drink,
might have had a drink with Joe. But, I spoke with him after the races. And I used to see him at City Tats a bit. But to give you an idea, he would come and Bert Lilly, great racing rider, mate of mine, gave the anecdote. He went up to after Joe won the Golden Slipper birthday card. And Joe wanted
Roy
to...
Greenwood.
And he was... They're outside. It would have been the Golden Nugget or it might have been the other Carlisle Club. And Joe said, here's some money, Bert. And Bert said, no, Joe, he said, I don't want the money.
Yeah.
Really, I got powerful money. Bert, he said, here I am at King's Cross, mate. And Joe he said, take it. And he said, and I said, no. And he said, money's
Just
going
wanted to give
everywhere.
everyone.
Ladies of the night said, here's a Brit. He said, Bert wouldn't take it, and Joe wouldn't have him not taking it. And that's the sort of thing he is. And on that particular occasion, we'll say some of the nearby ladies did get a bonus.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he was much loved by everyone, helped everyone. Not only was he generous with money, but anyone in any trouble, he would help. Forever helping people get out of trouble with the police and that.
So what you mentioned Perce Galea. Why don't we move on and talk about him?
Sure.
And this is a time when you were older and saw a lot more going
I knew
on.
Perce reasonably well. I knew his
So
son Bruce.
this is what David Hickey says about Perce Galea in his book. Perce Galea, the uncrowned king of illegal casinos in Sydney and one of the nation's biggest and most flamboyant punters. He started out as a paperboy, milkman and wharfie, but by the 1960s was regularly backing racehorse in multiples of £10,000. He won so much at Eagle Farm in June 1962 that he had to borrow an overnight bag from a course official to carry the cash back to his hotel room. Galea took great pride in his personal appearance and became known as the Prince in racing circles. So I've got a bit more written about some of the clubs, but why don't you talk a bit about what you knew about?
I'll start with what I remember. But he always immaculately dressed. I remember as a kid at the races, because my father was friendly with him. He knew me, and because I was my father's son, of course. And I remember a couple of times he'd give me $5. And this was in the 70s. $5 would be like, I don't know, a can of Coke was 20 cents or whatever, so it'd be like $75 or something.
Yeah.
And he'd just give you $5. Oh, thanks, Mr. Galea, I used to call him.
Yeah.
Call me Perce, But so I've got fond memories of him because he was always smiling and that. But he was a massive punter.
Yeah.
But he passed away in the early 80s, I suppose. But Max would know more about his betting than I. But he was known as a huge punter. He was always in the paper.
Pretty similar to Hollywood George.
He had some good horses.
Colourful, flamboyant. He was flamboyant, correct?
Yeah, no, well, he was, you'd say flamboyant. He had a different style to Hollywood.
Yeah.
He was flamboyant. He was a big punter. People followed him around the betting ring. I had a fair bit to do with Perce because he used to go to he owned racehorses. Eskimo Prince was his best.
He had some good ones.
He'd go to the track every morning. And I'd go to the track every morning in those days. So on a quiet morning, you'd spend a bit of time talking to Perce. Perce was an outgoing sort of a pet. He didn't mind what, he'd tell you a tale. Most of them, which you couldn't write. And one of his bad habits was Eskimo Prince wasn't a big feeder. And he'd go and he'd be feeding this horse carrots. And the trainer, Cess Rolls, he said, Perce, don't. He said, we're trying to get some good grain into this bloody horse. You're giving him carrots, you're giving him sugar. Don't. Like, he won't, I can't get him to eat anything. But he, you know, Perce was there, and of course he'd tell me all of the business, what was going on. He was in charge. He was handling the politicians. He was handling he was handling everybody that had to be paid. He was the go-between. And he told me the story. He said about one of his people. He was the spokesman for the clubs. They'd give, you know, there were a number. He had clubs, but there were others that in the same area. And a young bloke built up a debt of 10,000, which was a considerable amount at the time. So a young bloke, as Perce said to me, so he said, they said, look, go and get this money or we'll have to get it ourselves. And they said it was going to mean a bit of trouble for the young bloke. And so Perce said, don't do anything, leave it with me. So Perce has rung up the secretary, Sir Frank Packer's secretary, and said, my name is Perce Galea, can I have an appointment to see Sir Frank Packer? This is Sir Frank Packer with a big glass. And he said, yes, and your business, all it concerns his son Kerry. And I said, yeah, well, okay. And secretary rings back, Sir Frank will see you at 10 a.m. Monday morning. So Perce has gone in there. And this is Perce telling the story. This isn't second hand. He's telling me the story. Yeah. He said, this big office, like a football oval, with big, he said, desk down the bottom with this great big man with black sunglasses. He said, I've come in and genuflect. He said, what do you want? He said, well, it's about young Kerry. He said, yes, what about young Kerry? He said, well, he's got into a bit of trouble with the gambling. Baccarat. He said, yes. How much trouble? He said, oh, well, 10,000, Sir Frank. What do you want me to do about it? Well, he said, look, I think it'd be in the best interest of everybody if the debt was paid. Because he said, these are very dangerous men. He said, okay. He said, according to Perce, big, what do you want me to check 10,000? He said, right, who will I make it out? Well, he said, cash would be quite, being ripped it out. He said, there. And he said, yeah, take this, Galea. He said, and go back, and he said, you'll find out what a very dangerous man is. Yes. If I ever hear of him going into one of these clubs again, he said, or I ever hear of him having a bet in any of these clubs again, he said, I'm the dangerous man. He said, I'll close a lot of you down. He said, now try me.
That's a great story.
Genuflected back out of the place and ran the last 30 yards, got out of there. You know what happened? The club proprietors come to me and said, Perce, you're going to have to go and see this bloke again. The fella's got on for 10,000. He said, hey, you were told not to let him on.
So you went
have
back
let
again.
him on. You will wear the 10,000 for being that. But it does show you something too about Kerry. Like he knew. He got square.
Yeah.
So
Right. They're all cunning. They're all cunning. Yeah.
And, but this is and that was Perce would talk to me. He said, about some people. He said, so-and-so's still alive. I said, yeah, he's in, I think it was Frank Brown, who was a great journalist at the time. Oh, he said, yeah, Frank Brown. He said, well, he said, it changed. He said, I'm working on a new budget. I just don't know, when was he last heard of? I said, in Zimbabwe. Yeah. He said, he's still getting his pension. He said, that's going to have to stop. But that was Perce. But Perce around the race course, he won the Golden Slipper with Eskimo Prince. He threw a handful of notes, said about $150, which people make light of today, but then it was a drink over the fence. He was like Joe, not to the same degree, but I think, the average punter, the average person, I think they had a bit in common with Perce, and I think Perce had a bit in common with them. So history should remember him well.
He'd be a lot more flamboyant than Joe, a lot more out there than Joe. Joe was an under-the-radar guy, really, wasn't he?
Joe was a different personality.
From what I understand, because I knew Perce better than
Perce
I knew
was
Joe.
closer to Hollywood as far as the
absolutely.
persona was concerned. Different type of man, different.
You'd never hear
different
about
type
Joe.
of
I suppose Joe died in '76, but Perce would often be in the paper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
about
And he
making
rode a column.
statements about
Yeah.
his horses. My horse is going to do this, and he had another good horse called Sticks and Stones, which
Yeah.
held the course record at Randwick for a long time.
Yeah.
And Princess Talari, and they had another good horse that won the Metro.
So just before we stop talking about
Serene Star.
Yeah.
That's it.
just before we stop talking about the clubs, and you can
Sir Serene.
I'll just read this little passage about what the clubs are like, and then you can talk a little bit about them, Adam, because you worked in them and whatnot.
I did work in them.
So this is talking about the Forbes Club. The Forbes Club's location was advertised by a neon sign protruding over the footpath from above the door of the front door of a 3-story terrace house at 155 Forbes Street, just off William Street. So just on the fringe of the city, very close to where we are right now. Every taxi driver in Sydney knew it. It was regularly photographed by the media and became something of a permanent attraction on prime time television programs. Boxers worked as doormen, and one staff man was a former North Bondi lifesaver of some note. There was also an electronic security system, though entry was freely available to any reasonably attired person. Crowds numbered up to 200 a night, and you could leave your car with the man in the white coat at the club's unofficial car park across the road, and you would know it was safe. A multitude of young, glamorous hostesses, obviously chosen for their looks, and croupiers in plunging evening dresses supplied by management, mixed with the players, fetched free cigarettes and drinks, and often doubled down as late night escorts. Often doubled as late night escorts. So the Forbes Club was closed down in 1976, but new clubs sprouted up all over the place. And this is probably when you can start to talk a bit about it.
Well, I never went to the Forbes Club. I was too young for that. But I started working. My first job was at the Palace for Perce Galea. Mm-hmm. God love him. May he rest in peace. Great fellow. At the Palace in about 1982, 83.
Yep. How old were you then?
18 and 19. No, probably closer to 19.
And what was your job?
I was the cashier because it was the baccarat, but they were playing chips. It was funny how it worked. The police said you can play baccarat, which was illegal. This is what I was told, and it would be right. But they weren't allowed to put cash on the table. They had to play with chips for some reason. I don't know what. So I was the cashier of the chips. I was in charge of the money, which was an entrusted job because I was Jack's son. That's why, because he was friends with Bruce, and that's how I got the job there because I was Jack Sparrow's son. That was my first job there. Then they changed it to cash, so I didn't need to work there anymore. And I got a job down at Double Bay Casino, which was next to Woolworths for Tony Torrock. I used to deal poker down there. And the highlight of that was every Thursday night, the great George Freeman, another great man, who I liked. Don't believe everything you hear. He used to have his private poker game, and I used to deal that, and that was a good gig. I used to get about $800 a night. And that
Wow.
It was
They
good money.
keep throwing you little...
No, you get a tip. You deal half an hour on, half an hour off, and whoever won the pot would throw $20 to you.
So
but you'd have to give half back to the house.
This is your university, right? You went to the University of the Gaming Club.
This was after this is after I finished working at the racecourse.
Right.
I was an old man when I finished the racecourse.
And was it ever did it ever even cross your mind that you'd go to university and do something like that?
No, not at all. I was at university. When I say I stopped working for bookies at the races. I started just handling money then when I was doing that.
Yeah. Did you do the HSC?
No, please.
No.
I did HSC with Robbie Waterhouse.
When did you leave school?
When I was 16.
Right. What school were you at?
The Scots College.
And you
first
didn't make
term, fifth form.
So you didn't make year 12?
No, first term, fifth. But the
had to get out there and get working.
The headmaster called me and said, "What are you doing here?
Yeah.
We don't need you at this school."
So you went to the University of the Racetrack
And I just went home to my father.
Clubs.
Said, "Dad, I want to leave school." He said, "I left on the Thursday. On the Saturday, I was working for the Waterhouses."
Yeah.
For Rob.
All right. Well, so anything more to add about the clubs? I mean, it sounds like it was a magnificent time.
But after that, my dad opened the two up, and I ran the two up down at Chippendale, and I ran that when I was 21. I retired from the gambling casinos at 21. Then I went out and just full on betting.
And when did they all get shut down? The clubs? When did it all get?
About 80. Look, they were open probably till about 88, I suppose, 89, and there was the odd one probably floating around. But during the 80s, there was about 50 clubs in Sydney.
Yeah.
Because I tell you why, and this is interesting. A couple of people, Perce Galea and an old friend of mine named Wally, they took it to court that blackjack was a game of skill and not a game of chance. So the magistrate ruled on it so that they were allowed to play blackjack, and they also ruled that poker was a game of skill and not a game of chance. So that meant that you could play them. So all these clubs popped up everywhere. Games like Baccarat was still illegal, and the 2-up was still illegal, even though we had the 2-up. And we were the only 2-up club in Sydney.
But why do you remember when they got shut down, Max? What was it? A particular premier who came in?
I'd say it was Neville Rand, but just going back to the casinos.
That was in the 70s, Neville Rand.
I had to do a story. The Sun sent me down to do a story in the opening casino in Hobart. And I went there and said, compared to the Sydney casinos, this is Woolworths and Coles. Because what Adam was describing, or what you've just described there, it had more than a liberal dash of class about it. And where Adam was saying too about no cash on the counter, no, well, casinos don't deal in cash; they deal in their own special currency. But we in Sydney, those casinos, they had something. Look, I for reasons I've already expressed, I wasn't a big casino goer there, only because I had to get up early in the day after punting on the tracks and everything. I didn't have anything left. But by gee, if you wanted to have a night out, anybody that wanted to have a night out and have a bet, they were the places.
And everyone to be dressed nice and everything.
Yeah.
Like, it was classy.
Yeah. Why they closed down was because they wanted to make... I've got no doubt Kerry Packer was behind them being closed down, to the sense they wanted to legalise it, no doubt. Because there was a campaign against, for example, our club at Chippendale. Channel 10 did a thing one night, and they went up to the door. They said, "See here, a bullet's been fired." It wasn't a bullet; it was some scratch on the door. They said they'd seen people being thrown in the boot outside. Completely fabricated. Nothing. It was the safest place you go to. The 2-up. You get looked after there.
No doubt. There's no doubt about
and you
that.
never ever did violent things in your club because it would turn people away.
Why the point I see why it ended like SP betting ended.
Yeah, exactly.
And Rand was the man there, and Merv Beck, and look. I'm very happy to say a couple of my best friends, people I grew up with, are SP bookies, and they were good SP bookies. But they didn't like Merv Beck was this untouchable copper.
Yeah.
I don't say that. I'm not bagging him. But he'd come through the front door with a sledgehammer. Now these people weren't into that.
Yeah.
And really SP.
But he was the 70s, those Max. After Merv Beck
yeah,
had gone,
I'm
they
saying,
opened up
but it
again
was-
in the 80s.
yeah,
They
it
closed down at the end of the 70s,
Yeah,
you're right,
but
and
I'm
they opened up
saying
again at
it
82.
started. But what I'm getting to, Adam, is to my recollection, in that era, corrupt as it was, everybody was getting a quid. Politicians were getting a quid.
Yeah.
The coppers were getting a quid. Everybody was happy.
Yeah.
The drug scene has been there since opium's been in sort of 1920s, but it wasn't a big thing when the SP was there, but it really exploded. Like, to my mind, when the SP closed and everybody had to get a quid elsewhere. And of course the Vietnam War came into it, and then the game, like, the tour and everything. People were getting, well, shall I say, backhanders out of that. But it was, to my mind, in many ways, it was a better society.
There was a crackdown, though, on SP.
Yeah.
I remember there's a gaming squad. I know firsthand because I was arrested with Reg Andrews. I was working for the lovely man, Reg Andrews.
Yes, but you only dealt in top companies. son.
You've got no idea my resume. My resume was with them all. Reg Andrews, I was working for Reg Andrews. I was 19, and there was a gaming squad.
Yeah.
They would come and kick the door in. That's what happened with the Double Bay. They kicked.
But see, once upon a time, if that happened, look, everybody had to take your turn to get pinched, and get fined, everything like that, and it worked in an orderly fashion. You were told, look, today is the day, and somebody would get a clean skin to take the fall, which would be a £20 fine in those days, and the system worked.
Yeah.
You could say that.
You know what it was? It was a $400 fine. When I got, but I didn't have to pay it.
Well, see,
Reg
that's
paid
how
Reg was one of the proprietors of the Forbes Club, by the way. He was a Forbes Club man, Reg Andrews. Lovely man. What a lovely bloke. You remember Reg? How good a bloke was Reg? He was wonderful.
Why don't we talk about George Freeman? So this is, I got an excerpt. This is from gamblingsites.org. George Freeman was a very successful illegal bookmaker in Australia. His willingness to accept any size wager is why he was able to serve such a vast clientele. Although Freeman has had several run-ins with the law, no one was able to convict him of anything serious, which allowed him to live as a free man most of his life. George Freeman was born in January 1935 in Annandale in the middle of the Great Depression. When Freeman was just a few years old, his father abandoned the family, leaving Freeman, his mother, and his two siblings to fend for themselves. Since his mother didn't have a well-paying job, the family was forced to move to the slums and would often go to bed hungry. So that's a bit of background on George Freeman. You knew him well, did you? Or?
I did know him well, yeah. And my dad used to do a lot, and I did business with him myself, betting with him. And
so he was a punter, and he was an SP, was he? A big
he was
SP?
an SP bookie originally, but he was a big punter as well.
Yeah.
He loved punting. I think it's fair to... He originally got his first big kick of money out of the trots.
Right.
In the early to mid-70s. They won a fortune at the trots. They put all the SP bookies out of business on the trots. What people don't know is up until the mid-70s, say, you could get as much on a trotter or a dog with the SP bookies as you could with the horses. And that was astronomical money. But George put the SP bookies out of business on the trots, and a fellow who you're going to talk about later, Ray Hopkins, put them out of business on the dogs.
Yeah.
So, by the time I was an adult and doing business with SP bookies, you couldn't put a bet on the dogs or trots.
And so was George Freeman getting outstanding inside information
Well,
on the trots?
That's a nice way of putting it. Probably, I think they were backing a lot of winners at the trots.
Yeah,
that's why he got the name the Red Hops. I think.
Yeah, right.
And it was notorious for it.
Yeah.
But you could get, as I said, you go to the trots on a Friday night, it was packed. There was 50 bookies there, wasn't it? Like that was in 1980, in 1970.
It was red hot long before George Freeman got there. Don't you
No,
worry
I'm
about
sure.
that.
But they turned it to an art form, though.
Wow.
I think they turned it to. But he won. That's where he got his original big kick from.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he started betting big on the horses.
What was your experience with George Freeman?
No, I spent a bit of time with George. Probably more time, as I said, due to the early mornings with Perce. But George was a raconteur. He told us some great stories, which George, I think, was a protege of Joe Taylor.
For sure.
Then George got plenty of experience with one of the greats of racing, Melbourne Mick Bartley. Incredible story, incredible man. But George, as far as the trots go, George told me the story about one of his men come to him and he said, I've got one on Friday night. He said, won't need any help. He said, win by the length of the straight. He said, yeah, well, that's all right. But he said, it'll go up at 6-4. He said, the first blink of any support. He said, it'll be 3s on. And he said, however, there could be a way because a leading bookmaker at that stage was paying $750 for a dead. And as he said, the story unwound. He said, you wouldn't believe it. We've had the good luck. Our race was the last race. So we've got 2 earlier deadens, plus this one was the 3rd one. The 2 previous ones got beaten. Everything's going to plan. So up goes the good thing in the last. George's favourite bookmaker, 7-2. George, they got on for everything.
Wow.
He said, and it was going 7-2, 4-1. They play, come in, sucker, 3-1, 7-2, 4-1. He said, George said to me, but he said, that wasn't enough. He said, I got the money, it wasn't enough. He said, I had to go up to him and say, Bill, 7,000 to 2,000. And he said, he's looked at me in the eye and he said, get it off, we've all been had. And he said, it did win by the length of the straight.
Wow.
Another one of the George stories, he had this...
Well, Bill and George had a big feud. They used to have a massive feud, Bill Waterhouse and George.
But he had this place at Yowie Bay. He used to ring me up at the Sun, and if I wasn't there, he'd say, you've got a message from Yowie Bay, George. He's a very good contact, but he said he's there one day, Saturday morning, and he said there's all, very big Saturday morning, betting slips, they're taking bets and everything. He said, he said, we could hear these helicopters. And he said it was like something like out of their picture, they're hovering in there. He said, it must be an army exercise. Went out to the roof and had a look at them. Said, Black Hawk down there, all coming in. And he said, suddenly, I realised that they were raiding the joint. It's these helicopters. They're going to land on the roof. And I said, what happened? He said, I've got to go and get rid of the slips. Well, they had to go and get rid of the evidence that they were taking.
So they raided his house via helicopters.
They had to run down, they had to try and get all the evidence of betting down the Dunnies, whichever way they could, because they were landing. Coppers were landing
In
on-
Yowie Bay.
Well, they had
Yowie
also
Bay.
the rice paper. You write the bets on
Yeah.
and put them in a bucket of water to evaporate.
Yeah,
That was what we
And
used
all
to have
of
the
this-
rice paper. yeah.
Well, this massive operation, they've come down, they've got them, and he said, I don't reckon they would have spent under about 10,000 to mount the helicopter.
Pinch it for SP,
He said, I got pinched $500.
That's right. It was a 4 or 5. I remember when I got pinched, would have been around the same time, $400 fine.
And
That's what it
George,
was.
too, he got shot outside the house. He said there was this wall. And you look at it, and he said, every time I go in it, I look at it and I marvel at it. But he said, it's fear. He said, when I got shot, he sort of leapt over the wall. And he said, I've looked at the wall every time I go in the front door now. I said, how did I ever get over that?
Yeah.
The
He
adrenaline.
said,
The
"That's what
adrenaline
he
gets you
said."
over.
You know, it was a high jump.
Running for your life.
But no, but George, with the racing authorities, they tried to warn him off. He had an
Well,
association.
he very rarely went to the races.
He didn't.
He was
He
never
wasn't
at the
there,
race.
but-
I had seen him. I saw him at the races once, I think, in my life.
And they
He
took
did
the
very-
picture of him with Murray
that was another
Farquhar, the
day, yeah. I
chief
saw him at Warwick
magistrate,
Farm
who
one day,
He
yeah.
was tipping to.
That's right.
And, you
And
know,
Nick
it's...
Powell, Dr. Nick.
But no, he owned Mr. Digby.
Yeah.
And there was a scandal over Mr. Digby. I think it got beat on the Monday at Canterbury in a bog track.
He got beat the start before.
And then it come out 4 or 5 days later on a good track.
At Wednesday at
And
Canterbury.
it won very well. And they outed Harry Clark, I think was the trainer.
Kay Banks was... Harry Clark was the trainer and Keith Banks was the jockey.
But they tried to get George on that. I don't think the track was so bad, and I got very heartened about Deadness. The track was so you could not pin a bad run on a bog track like that. They've sent out, how would you want to back it? And they mightn't have backed it. And it's come out in a better track. And
But saying that, Mr. Digby was a pretty good horse. He
It
ran
was.
fourth in an AJC Derby
he
when
was
the
good.
AJC Derby was probably a better race than it is now because they were more seasoned, the stayers. Rosa Kingston won it. I think Gurner's Lane ran second that went on to win a Melbourne Caulfield Cup double. And the third horse was a horse called Our Planet, which was a good horse. The Foysters owned it. And it ran fourth. So, and it ran good race in the Rosehill Guineas.
but
This was a shitty midweek race at Canterbury. I was on it. I had 200 each way at 15-4. It started 5-4. It was off the map. Then they put some money on it. That day.
Don't give that glow, that inner glow.
I
Of,
mean, 200 each way I got on. 15-4. Off Donny Todd.
But they took a very dim view of
I remember.
a very dim view of the previous run. But
Yeah, that's
I
right.
don't think it was that hot. It asked the question, but I thought the explanation was reasonable.
It won by 7 lengths.
And well, what do you want to?
No, I'm just saying
Do
it
you
won
wanna
by
make it
7
look-
lengths.
it-
It was
it's like-
it was beautiful to watch. I remember it being a care. I was only 17 at the time.
The point
It's a
is
beauty.
that the chief steward got into big trouble over John Marnie, and John Marnie he ended up driving a tractor at Canterbury after that to get her. But he went over to West Australia. He had a very colourful career after that. But no, George. He was very hard to. Bill Waterhouse wouldn't let him on. But
He was a very
'Cause he was too-
knowledgeable
he was too
racer.
smart for
No,
Bill,
he
was
was
he?
a very knowledgeable
But he was.
bloke.
He was. He dealt with
racing.
hard men too, and grew up with hard men.
Yeah.
He always said like he did 18 months for shoplifting at Palmer's, H.G. Palmer's. H.G. Palmer, I think,
Was a
worth
department
about
store,
$150. H.G. Palmer touched the joint for about 1.5 million and went to a holiday farm for a week or two. So, there were great stories with George. He was a great raconteur, storyteller.
But a huge punter, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He'd have 50,000, I think, back in the day. Like, one of my jobs was running off ringing him
Yeah.
when there was no mobile phones. 5258090 was, I remember the
So
name.
you had to-
5258090 was the number.
So
I
you were
remember
calling
still.
him back at his SP joint.
I would
wherever
ring
it was.
him, but he'd say, "You want my father to back this," and I'd run on. Then my father had a bipper, a thing, and he could send the message what he wants
Yeah.
to back. But my job was run off Randwick or Rosehill, which was quite a way. You had to run probably 500 metres there, 1,000 metres there and back type thing to the phone across the road in the service station at Randwick, or the one in the bowling club at Rosehill.
So it was all blacked out then to get information onto the course and to off the course and to affect the prices.
Yeah.
It was such a big business. Like, you know, you could, they wanted to back one. If one was being backed SP, they'd want to get the money onto the course.
All that.
And
It was a big industry. The SP was huge.
And I don't think, Adam, today a lot of people grasp just what a big business SP was.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Well, the SP, you could get as much on a horse in the 70s. You could get you get $500,000 probably on a horse SP. Anything you like. Like Melbourne Mick was the big SP bookies, but there was a bloke called John Rogan, who was a huge bookie. Jack Lynn.
Yeah.
All of these blokes. There was a huge network. This is before TA. Well, the TAB had started, but you know, there was no. What it was, there was no Sky Channel. So people would go to, there was no pub tab. I don't know when the pub tab came in, but there was no pub. So every pub had an SP bookie. Every pub in Sydney had an SP bookie.
Yeah.
You'd walk in there and have a bet. Any pub. Whatever suburb you went to, go to Dubbo in the pub, there'd be an SP bookie there, right? So it was a huge network.
But
And when big bets come in, they'd ring them back to whoever. Yeah.
you mentioned Jackie Lind there.
Jackie Lind.
And you had Mark Reed on this outlet recently, but Mark Reed told me the story that he went to, his family had a very big connection. His mother was a big punter, Mabel Reed, and his family had a big connection with Melbourne Mick.
Yeah.
And he had one in the Blue Diamond, 50 to 1 chance, I can't think of it now, and he got to me, he said, we want to back this SP, and he said, well, I don't do it now, but he said, Jackie Lind will handle the business, which he did. And Mark, I can't remember the figures now, Mark had a very big each way bet on this horse. We're talking about 33, 50 to 1. And it ran second or third.
Yeah.
And the point was he got so much on SP, quarter the odds. And you just don't, when you see what they get on for today, and it's just, you just can't, people don't believe you.
It was massive, mate.
So we've got 3 more people to talk about, and we moved to a bit of a different era now, where I think probably the whole idea of doing the form and computers and stuff start to come in more, and we get sort of to where we are now, where the game is so vastly different. But Don Scott and the Legal Eagles, Don Scott's sort of, he's probably the godfather of form.
Yeah.
And when you know the brief conversations I've had with Rob Waterhouse, he says that he learned a lot of what he does off him.
Everybody learnt off Don Scott.
Yeah, and Don Scott's written that famous book. Is it called Winning Ways? Winning with Don Scott.
And winning more.
I think he wrote 3 books, in fact.
3 books, yeah. And I think the last one might have been the most successful. So I don't know much about Don Scott and the Legal Eagles, but I'll just read this one excerpt I got off the internet. And someone asked Don Scott the question, how much time are you spending on form study, etc., every week? And Don Scott says back, I spend about 12 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. I have 2 computers. One is linked to the telecom Viatel service, so I'm able to call up all the current tab dividends on race days to see what punters are backing and what price each horse is. And the other is a computer that has my special program for the trifecta betting. So I'd like to break this up into 2 parts. One, I might get you, Adam, to tell me why you wanted to put Don Scott on our sheet, and then and then what I'll get Max to do is put a bit of colour to the what the Legal Eagles were and what that was all about. So why did you want to put...
Well, Max would know better than me when they started, but my recollection's the early 70s.
Your bottom button's undone if you want to do it up.
This one here?
Yeah, it doesn't do up. Yeah.
They were a bunch of law graduates. Don, I think, studied law at university. They're all university students. Part of the other members were a bloke called Clive Evatt, who was a big... Morgan Ryan was on the fringes of it. Peter Waker was a bookie. But Don Scott, he had a big team, and I suppose they came to prominence, correct me if I'm wrong, Max, in the 70s. That's when they come to prominence, or...?
Yeah, I can lose decades. The actual original Legal Eagles, there was a lot of legal men betting at that time, were Don Scott, who was the mastermind, Bob Charlie, who
Bob
was
Charlie
not
was
a
in it,
legal
sorry.
man,
Yep.
and Clive Evatt, who was very, very much a legal man. But there were other legal people betting Morgan Ryan was fluttering around the ring. Probably the biggest one of them all and the most successful of them all was the most successful Legal Eagles, and I won't. He's still going strong. I don't know.
You're talking
Michael
McHugh
was regarded by Robbie Waterhouse as bigger than the Legal Eagles. Now separate them, but the Legal Eagles and Don Scott, they were the headliners of the time. And Don Scott was the playmaker, supported by Bob Charlie and by Clive Evatt.
Weren't they very different to all the people we've talked about before? It sounded like it was very much about inside knowledge and knowing trainers and all this kind of stuff. And wasn't Don Scott and Legal Eagles the first team to push that all aside and just analyse the form of a horse and start to use computers to help them do that? And that's where they found a great edge. Am I right in saying that Don Scott wasn't getting calls from trainers saying this horse is going to do that, It was just all his own.
Yeah, he wouldn't have been getting as much information as the previous we've talked about. They all did their own form in their own way, though. But I think it's a fair thing to say Don Scott revolutionised the way of doing form, and he evidently was a genius.
Yeah.
The way he could work out how much each kilo or pounds when he started, it might have been, to a length. Things like that. He might have been the first person to really turn it into an art form, I suppose you could say, and using the computers.
So he was the forerunner to the Zeljko syndicate today and the Dr. Mick syndicate.
A lot of people, they all would have. It all started. Look, one of the most famous betting syndicates, the Manuals from South Australia. They learnt by reading his book.
Yeah, right.
And they took it from there. So Don Scott formulated the basis, I think, better than anyone else of how you do form. And then, of course, it's been much improved by Dominic Beirne and Mark Reed in the early 80s and the Manual brothers, and now the Zeljkos and Dr. Nicks of the world. Well, I'm sure how they do their algorithms, Don Scott's original theories go into that.
Did you have anything to do with Don Scott, Max?
No, I followed Don Scott. Don Scott was one of those people, which I think you've covered. He brought in a new form reference. You mentioned computers were coming into play. There were great form analysts before Don Scott, and great judges who did form. And I think the 3 pounds for length, I think that's been around. But when I think of Freddie Engels.
Fred Engels was I knew Fred Engels' son. I met him.
Yeah, but Freddie Engels, some of them, and some of them, some of the old time bookies would do their own, their own televising of races, and the clocking. But see, it's changing now. Now it's all gone to the clocking, the timing, points like that. But then look, possibly one of the great form analysts of the world was Bull in England, time form, revelised time. Well, Don Scott came into that, and Don Scott was the mathematician, brought that into the game, and then the times, and went into it very methodically, and wrote so well about it. But at the end of the day,
and only did form on Sydney, though.
Yeah, but then again, he got disillusioned. He'd go to Melbourne, but at the end of the day, while he was a great mathematician, a great writer, he left. I don't think he was, shall we say, that people had come after him that you've mentioned, and particularly when you look at students like Dominic Beirne, really. Don was the forerunner. Don opened the innings.
That's right.
I don't think Don was the major.
By the 80s, Don was passe. By the 80s. He was a thing of the past.
And when you look at Zeljko now, to what Zeljko's done and how he's done it, but that's the mathematics that that's beyond me. That's the mathematics. I'm more of a Hollywood George man.
Yeah.
We came up in a different era.
Yeah. But when you look at
different way of doing
how
things.
Zeljko, the old Sunday, I'm going back to the 1980s, and nobody knew anything about Zeljko. I knew something about him.
I did. I met him in '84 at the tour.
The Vulcan, which was an old rundown pub, Broadway near the Sun offices. He bought it so he could get the TAB commission.
That's right. They understood all
You know,
that.
and
Yeah.
it's-
Put his own bets through, get them very clever.
And you say, well, how
Greg
much-
Beirne was the first to do that.
but there
Dominic's
you go.
brother, he was the first to do that.
But you think the money that they pulled out of it, that David Walsh, who was, where would he be one of the lieutenants or a partner?
No, it's his
David Walsh,
partner.
like
No, I
this
think David
massive-
Walsh is
massive
equal
bloody
with Zeljko,
museum.
I don't know.
This wonderful museum in Hobart, worth a squillion quid.
It's good to see that he's done something for the people.
Well, he
with it,
has,
yeah.
and he has, and but it just
My
shows
word.
you the enormity of it and how good the bloke is at it.
No, they're freaks at it, mate.
Because all the punters, the big punters we know, we've all, they've been there, done that, probably ended up with very little. But have a look at Zeljko and Walsh. Geez, they've done well.
Yeah,
They've
no,
got
it's
a
incredible.
different, but in saying that, they grew up in a different mentality, Zeljko
Yes.
and David Walsh, compared to the Hollywood Georges,
Yeah.
the Jack Sparrows,
it's
the
worlds
rest
apart,
of the
yeah.
George Freemans. You know,
Yeah.
they've come from that well-educated university, mathematics, background.
You're not suggesting. Hey,
Hollywood
hey,
and my father both left school at 13.
you're not suggesting.
George never went to school.
Well, I'm
I
going to
think,
say, you're not suggesting that, our lack of education. You were thrown out of Scots when you were 16.
That's right.
I
Good
left
decision
school-
by
I
Scots.
was left out of school, when
So
I was
you-
15.
Yeah.
So if you'd finished high school, you guys could have been like David Walsh
No,
and Zeljko.
not at all. No, not at all. No, I'm just saying it was a different grounding.
I tell you,
So
in
they-
many ways, Jack,
But I wouldn't exactly call David Walsh and Zeljko actual punters.
No, yeah.
they're mathematicians.
They're mathematicians.
Yeah.
It's a different sort
But
of thing.
the point about education, and you've got to have it today.
Of course.
But there you are. We've got Adam here. As I said,
I've
I
got
left
through.
school-
I've got through the long grass.
Well, you got it. You got.
I've
a
got through
benefit.
the long grass.
Hey,
I've done well.
Hey, but he went to school. I left school when I was 15. 2 days after my 15th birthday. I'm not particularly proud of it. I wasn't any good at school.
And did you become a cadet journalist straight away?
Oh, geez, I've become a copy boy.
Yeah.
Jack was a
15.
copy boy.
Yeah.
My father.
But you were working in newspapers straight away.
Jack was a copy
But what
boy.
I'm getting to is education. Now, two of the smartest men of my time, and I'll throw them in against anybody, were Tommy Smith
Brilliant.
and Melbourne Mick Bartley. Both, I think, were closer to illiterate
Yeah.
than they were.
Yeah, Tommy
in
couldn't
other
read or
ways.
write. Yeah.
But there again, mathematician skill. Well, you said Tommy couldn't read or write. Lloyd Williams said that if he wanted a good CEO of a major company,
brilliant
Tommy
man.
Smith would have been the man.
But he couldn't read or write,
And
I don't think. I don't
there
think
is
till
Melbourne
day he
Mick
died.
Bartley, who was a street kid.
Yep.
Great story.
Back
about
streets of
Melbourne Mick,
Fitzroy.
yeah. And both ended up with harbour frontages and rollers.
That's right. They both ended up with
And there
both
you
Rolls
go.
Royce
So
brothers.
you tell me, and I don't bag education, and you talk about Zeljko and those like the latter age geniuses, but by gee, what was it about those people?
Yeah. Oh, they
that
had
made him
nous.
so
They had
good.
nous. Yeah. No, but what my point is, it's a different way they do things when you've had that university education. I'm not talking about what to do smarter or,
No, too.
they have to do things. Melbourne Mick did things from a different angle. Melbourne Mick invented things. Like he got a way of getting the shortener from Melbourne before it got to Sydney, and he got the jump on things. He understood, and of course they all got rich out of getting the com. 5% com with the SP bookies in those days, handling big money. One punter I think turned $1 million over one weekend. We're going to talk about I think the punter, and Melbourne Mick he earned 50,000 com one weekend, and this is in the 70s.
But even against that, Adam,
You still gotta get
Melbourne Mick plundered the computer-toted
Oh,
camera.
he
You remember
was an innovator, mate. An innovator, brilliant man.
You had to pick the 6 winners on the program, and that's where his mathematics come in. He got it twice.
Oh,
He
he's
put him out
brilliant,
of
yeah.
play.
So let's talk about Terry Page. You want to give us a bit of an intro, Ben? I've got a nice little excerpt about when he owned the Coogee Bay Hotel. But if you
Well, I
want-
worked for Terry Page
Okay.
when he was a bookie.
and why was he so influential and such a big bookie?
Well, he clearly had nerves of steel. He was a huge bookie. He bet in telephone numbers. Everyone was, but I suppose he was a very good client finder.
Yeah.
He's very good at finding the client, and he had a great. And he came from sort of nothing. Well, Max would know better than me from the simple fact where he came from, because you would have known him longer than me. But he had a meteoric rise, Terry Page, really, didn't he?
He did.
Before you knew it, he owned the Coogee Bay Hotel, which he bought off Darby Munro's wife, Kath
So why don't
Munro.
I'll stop you there. So he bought the Coogee Bay Hotel for $3.5 million, and I like this one. It's not really to do with what we're talking about, but
I
it's
thought he paid less for that. Where does it say that?
I think it said in the.
I don't think that's correct. I think
He did a special deal with
One
Kath
point-
Munro.
I think it was 1.3.
I think it was a special deal.
Yeah.
I think there might have been some on top and some other, but we won't go into that.
No, I'll tell you what I thought it was the deal, and I could be wrong. He paid $1.3 million for it. He gave her $300,000 up front and gave her $200,000 every year for 5 years.
Yeah, that's the sort of
Right?
deal
Yeah.
I heard.
That's what I heard
Yeah.
when I was a little boy.
Yeah, no,
Now
that's-
whether that's 100% right or not, I don't know.
That's
And
So
Coogee Bay
1.3.
Hotels, it'd be worth every part of 150
and
to
he
200
bought
million
it,
now.
and because I grew up in Coogee,
Yeah.
he owned that when I was about 9 or 10. That was about 73 or 74. I was about 9.
So let me read this because it was during Terry Page's stewardship over that hotel that the nightclub Salinas became one of Sydney's go-to entertainment venues. It was reputedly named after Terry Page's daughter. For 40 years,
That's
Salinas
Selena,
hosted some of rock music's biggest names, including in the 70s to 1990s, including Midnight Oil, Crowded House, In Excess, The Angels, Cold Chisel, Bob Geldof and the Boomtown Rats, Roxette, Nirvana, James Brown was also said to come with an entourage of 50 people, and Meatloaf opened his show by driving a motorcycle onto the stage. Not much to do with betting, but imagine being the biggest bookie in Sydney, and you're getting all those stars there.
Can I tell you something funny though about this? So we'd go to the races in the Rolls Royce. He had originally had the gold Rolls Royce, then he got the beautiful blue Corniche with the black roof. And when we go to Rose Hill, I'd leave my car in the car park and off we'd go in the Rolls Royce. And he loved that song Sheena Easton sang 9 to 5. That was his favourite
The
song.
Dolly Parton song.
When it had come on. I think he used to pay 2WS money to pay it on. He never used to listen to the races on the way to the races, by the way. Yeah. Never on 2K. It was on 2WS listening to music. And he liked Sheena Easton so much, he got her to perform at Salinas. And that is a fact. Like, I don't know what happened. I think he had such a crush on her.
Yeah.
That's
This
the
is a
sort
song
of
that
bloke
Dolly
he
Parton-
was. He got her to come out and play there.
Is this the Dolly Parton song you're talking
No.
about? Different.
My baby takes the morning train. Edit that bit. I can't sing a note. That one. Not working 9 to 5. The other 9 at Sheena Easton. He loved
and
Sheena. Anyway, that's another person who sang at Salinas because he loved her so much.
What was Terry Page like in Sydney in those days? Was he another big, bold personality? And
Yeah, he was.
My word, everyone knew
Terence,
him.
he came up as a meteoric rise because he was a bookmaker. Look, everybody comes from somewhere. He was a bookmaker. I think he'd handle a bit of money. He'd take a bet, and of course that got him to the forefront. It was his entrepreneurial flair, like he could see the Coogee, and he had, as I say, he wasn't a form man or anything to do with racing.
Didn't care about it at all. Just let him on.
Just get you into it. And it was his, his way of life. He wasn't a flamboyant personality. Well, he isn't a flamboyant.
He had a quiet personality.
He wasn't like a Mark Reed or anything like that. But he could get punters. He could send punters, and I think they gravitated towards him.
But it's a fair thing to say in the early 80s, Terry Page was as well known a person in Sydney as anybody. Everyone.
Well, he had a football team.
Everyone
a bit
knew
like
Terry Page.
Justin Hems these days, sort of.
Yeah, well, no,
similar
not
kind of.
promoting the quick, but he was just because he did the ad. Remember the Tui's ad? I feel like a Tui's. Malcolm Johnson. It was about Malcolm Johnson, and of course, then it had flicked to Terry on the stand. He'd be holding the.
Yeah.
But he was like even a TV personality.
Yeah.
Like people, even if you didn't go to the races, you knew not so much of Justin Hems, but Terry Page was less like. Oh, Terry Page, the big bookie.
Yeah.
Well, they'd be in the paper all the time, Terry Page takes this. But it was a different world, I suppose, where, Sydney was a small place.
Yeah.
And people like Terry Page were big news. It was before sport, it was when you couldn't have a bet on the tab in the football. There was only races to bet on, really, and dogs and trots at the tab. People didn't look at tennis much. The Australian Open was on, but racing was 85% of the gambling dollar was involved in racing, I think, in those days, is a fair thing to say. And Terry Page was an icon of Sydney. He really was big, and the Waterhouses were, of course. But Terry was this personality. Do you agree with that, Max?
Yeah, but
in a way,
it's funny because it wasn't as if he was an outgoing person.
no, he wasn't. No,
But
he's rather
was,
shy.
He was a sponsor. I started a radio show with Ian Craig for 25 years, and Terry and the Coogee Bay, they were they were sponsors, and at that stage, Dominic Beirne was more or less his
He did his
office
apprenticeship there. He was.
and Dominic Beirne would come on and give the Coogee Bay special and the lay of the day and everything like
Very
that.
true.
And might I say, was absolutely brilliant at it.
That's where
And
that's where Dominic started.
And when you see these young blokes, they're running around the place, and then you see Dominic, who was probably one of the best form assessors, and a very good bookmaker. I think if he'd lasted, probably would have been one of the greats. But in his time, in his period, was certainly there was Dominic Beirne and there was Robbie Waterhouse.
no one more astute than
were-
Dominic Beirne.
and there they were. But you look back at it, and Terry is still going.
He's up on the Gold Coast.
Well, when I was a little boy, I'd go into so the Coogee Bay Hotel was there. The office was at the back. They had like an office. Remember you coming in from Arms, on the left there was an office. And that was the racing. I'd go in there with my father. I would have been about 10 or 11. And Dominic's desk was the first desk, right? And I remember him walking in and goes, "G'day, Mr. Sparrow." He said, "You call me Jack." I remember Dominic calling my father Mr. Sparrow, like when I was... And I remember the day I was in there, because I've got a very good memory for things, he said, "Stop call me Jack, da-da-da-da." Dominic was a young, probably 19. I said, well, hang on, he's about 10 years older than me. He would have been 20, say, I suppose. And he was at the front desk doing the form. So Dominic's first job on the racecourse was for Terry.
Yeah.
And that's where he started. And, of course, the rest is history. Dominic became one of the... But Terry didn't care about form so much. No. He just played the punter.
Yeah.
He'd let them do whatever they... In Terry's eyes, no one could win punting. That was his theory. And I remember he said two things to me. He said, only mugs bet on horses. And he said, and there's only two kinds of people that own horses, millionaires and mugs. And at the time, millionaires were millionaires.
Yeah.
Millionaires or mugs, he said, own horses.
He said to me once, he said he was having a bad stretch. I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of millions he was down. His bank manager, he just said, well, he's got the Coogee Bay and has let everybody on. And they could be demanding times. And he said,
Him and Perce Galea had some massive betting clashes.
I went, he said, I said the bank manager, he said, well, how am I going? And you don't know what they own or what they owe or the whole thing. The bank manager said, well, keep going. But he said, I'll let you know when you can't, which is a terrific, I would say, terrific association to have with your bank manager. But his solvency must have been pretty strong. Well, with the Coogee Bay, everything with that. But no, by gee, like it was a big thing. He had a couple of, I think, promotions with John Singleton and...
Well, I remember when I was in the car that day in 1981 it was, he said, Singo's had 5,000 on Newtown with me. This was at the beginning of the season at 50 to 1.
Yeah.
And, of course, Newtown made the grand final that year.
Right.
Like, they were a 50 to 1 chance at the beginning of the season.
Yeah.
So he said, Singo just donated 5,000. I bet him 50's Newtown.
They got
and then
beat in the grand final, did they?
as the year progressed... Oh, they got a bit better than first.
So we've got one more to go, Ray Hopkins. And this is, I'll read a little excerpt about him. We can chat about him. And Ray Hopkins is still, as you say, doing very well. Lives in Sydney, correct? He's in Sydney? Yeah, right.
Yeah, he's still in Sydney.
This is
I
from an
saw him
article...
about 6 weeks ago.
An article you wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald in 2006, Max. And it's Cole Tidy talking about Ray Hopkins. This is what Cole Tidy says about Ray Hopkins. The best punter in my time was Ray Hopkins. You could get on for mammoth money in those days. When he was chasing, he would go to an SP, but would shorten it up himself by backing his fancy at the track as well. He was the biggest and the best. He would get on a losing streak and bet up bigger and bigger. So that's pretty big coming from Cole Tidy. And I think also when I was talking to Mark Reed said that Ray Hopkins was his hero.
Well, in the 60s and 70s, he was everybody's hero that was a
And he
punter,
was so he was the biggest punter of all, was he?
Well, they used to call him the Boy Wonder. That was his nickname in the 60s and early 70s. He would be the biggest punter of all time, I think.
Why? Why was he the biggest punter?
Oh, constantly just betting. When I say the biggest punter, that did it for so long
Yeah.
and consistently a big punter. Mm-hmm. Like, he was also a bookie.
Wasn't he the Bash
He was
King,
also
wasn't it?
Yeah, Bash King,
What was
they
it? It
called
was
him.
Bricknell, Abrams,
Stollery,
Stollery,
and
Hopkins. And why were they called the Bash King?
Well,
What,
the
they were-
initials. Bricknell.
Yeah, no, I know that. But, and so what, they all bet together, did they? They were a syndicate.
They said they were a syndicate. No, when they bet, that was the team. That's
And
what
they
they
bet on
said.
the-
I don't know
the-
how factual it is.
And you mentioned earlier on that Ray Hopkins put SPs out of business on greyhounds.
On the greyhounds, yeah.
Yeah.
He stopped it. He stopped it single-handedly, them taking bets on greyhounds. He won that much money,
Yeah.
so I believe.
Yeah.
And as I said, George and his mate, another bloke, who's still with us. We don't need to mention him. You know what I mean? Put them out of business on the trots.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ray, but much loved person, Ray.
And he's in his
Hopkins.
90s now, is he, Ray?
He's 90.
Yeah.
He's 10
You in
years
contact
younger
with
than
him,
my
Max?
father, yeah.
You in contact with Ray Hopkins?
Yeah, I was at Doyle's with him, I would say, on December 6th.
Isn't that
Nice.
great?
And Ray was very sharp.
Yep.
I think one of the secrets with Ray was, you find that the punters, and I think he was a bookmaker at the Dogs and everything, but the punters are in the limelight that strike the headlines. They're the ones that don't seem to last. They have their splash. They're like the firemen. You know, you look at them, the Hong Kong Tiger, a lot of even Hollywood
Felipe
George,
Ysmael.
even to a degree. But when you get the quiet men, which you've mentioned a few,
You're very quiet,
and,
Ray.
you know, the quiet men, they seem to not the headline men. Now I don't ever recall Ray.
Ray didn't have
making
an ego.
a headline, and that's the point. And I think you analyse this for me, but I think that, you know, when you get in the spotlight, and might have something to do with the personality, that the blast seems to subside. With
It's
the
a bad thing
punters.
having an ego when you're a punter.
But when you look at Ray, no ego, no
ego,
and you talk to him and very intelligent, have a good conversation with him and everything like that. But when I think there are real good days when you're chasing a big story and there was a Hollywood George or a Perce Galea, they're different, just a different class of horse, weren't they?
Yeah,
There was never a story with Ray, and there should have been.
Yeah.
When I say there should have been, of course, that's probably part of the success of him. You're not in the limelight. You're not. The tax people aren't looking at you. Other areas aren't paying you a lot of attention.
Hiding
You're
in
getting
plain
on,
sight.
You're getting set. You're getting through this great and wonderful world of punting and gambling and horses and dogs and you're surviving it. And it's
Another flip side of it, it's very hard to win booking and punting at the same time. Ray, well, it is. You're either one or the other. Dominic, I suppose. Well, Dominic gave the booking away to become a punter. Ray was a big punter and a big bookie at the same time.
and dogs and
Dogs as well. Now we'll go to the dogs. That's right.
Yeah.
You know, he was a betting machine. Yeah. But
All
as
right,
I said,
so-
much loved by everyone and very well regarded by everyone. Ray Hopkins is a much loved person.
Fantastic. So I think we've got a good history of Australia's biggest punters together. I definitely want to hear a bit from you, Max, just about yourself. So you're still working at the Sydney Morning Herald?
yes,
And how many articles do you do a week for them?
I do one for the Sydney Morning Herald. I'll one of most weeks one, but carnival time I might do two.
Yeah. And you were writing about James McDonald over the weekend. I read your article, enjoyed it as usual.
Yeah, J Mac, he's a pretty good jockey.
Where would you rate him as the jockeys you've seen?
He's very good. Look,
Who are your top
you
five
can't-
jockeys? Can we
well,
ask
you
you that?
can't. Rating look, my definition of a champion, be it horse or man or horse or human, is the buzz, the personal buzz they give you.
Yes.
There are a lot of greats, great jockeys, great horses, great trainers. But it's maybe it's because you win with it. Like Jim Cassidy is a champion, as far as I'm concerned. He was a champion. Damien Oliver's a champion. I still like to watch Ollie. Ollie still gives me a buzz. Get back to George Moore. There's no better jockey than George Moore. I think Athol Mully was just as good, but he was the finished product. Athol, look, he was spectacular. He was every bit as good, but he wasn't as finished as George. He never had the
Never had the
dedication.
drive, the dedication.
You know, and the beautiful jockey, like Peter Cook was a great jockey, but didn't have the drive.
Wonderful
Pete
jockey.
Dittman had the drive.
You got J-Mac up with all these jockeys?
He's in. He's getting to the great
He's
class.
getting
Yeah.
there. He's getting there.
Darren
He's got to do a
Beedman.
little bit more. Yeah, very good jockey.
You look at them, but I spout a bit about J-Mac now because he's the news. He is the best going today. But good judges tell me Zach Purton's every bit as good and probably even better. I don't see a lot
Well,
of
he's
Zach
probably got a
now.
bit more experience on him.
But you know, you say
Jockeys do get better.
And look, this I was going to say kid, but J-Mac's 31 now. But Moore reckons he didn't reach his peak till he was 35.
Yeah, they get better jockeys.
And some are has-beens at 21. But like he's getting there. He's getting there. But no, I've been very fortunate as you have. You come a bit late. You probably didn't see the best of Moore.
No, but I remember him as a little boy. Yeah, no,
You know, he
I
was
only heard his
what
name
you've
all
got
the
to
time.
try and temper. I think memory inflates.
Yes.
I was fortunate enough to see Clive Churchill. You know,
Yeah.
and the greatest. You can't imagine anybody being better than Clive. But it was a different game then.
Different game.
Now racing, not to the same degree, but it's different
It is different.
to what it was in George Moore's time, to what it was even in Darby Munro's time. People told me to see Darby Munro and Jim Pike. That Darby was the best jockey.
My
and
father
even-
said Darby was the best he ever saw.
and even comparing him with Moore, good judges said, look, Darby was better jockey. than
Darby.
Moore.
The old
But
blokes
I
all
never
say
saw
Darby.
it.
Yeah.
I can't go on a statistic, and it's like a lot of the good judges today. They don't go the race; they go on statistics. Well, all right, you're successful. Have a look at Zeljko. He's successful. You don't go to the race.
He wouldn't watch
but
a race,
Still,
no.
to me, what was your old man said about the races?
If you're not at the track, you're not in the race.
Yeah.
Well, you're always a chance, aren't you, at the track?
Who's
Well, you're always a chance when you're betting, I suppose.
Who's the best horse you've seen, Max?
Oh, again, you couldn't say it. I've never seen a better horse. I think you've got to look at longevity a bit. I'll make an exception with that because if you ever saw Todman, you never saw a better horse than Todman. Tulloch was a great horse. And yet Neville Selwood rode them both and he said any distance, any track, any conditions, Todman was the better horse.
Wow.
Tulloch did have a decision over him. But there are those points, but there again, in more recent times, Vane was a champion in my year, gave me that buzz. Sunline gave me that buzz. Mackay Diva gave me that buzz. Black Caviar. Well, look, she was
a freak.
restricted in a distance, but if you didn't get a buzz out of her, and of course Winks did. But the thing that Winks makes a comparison, and Kingston Town, I can't miss the King, that Winks could have won a Group 1 over 6 furlongs and I think could have won a Melbourne Cup.
Yeah.
But unlike the champions of old, was never tested to. And that's what Kingston Town could, Tulloch couldn't. You know, and to say that Black Caviar could have run past a mile, no. But those other horses, they gave me that buzz. But the great horses I miss, and I rebuke myself, are superimposed.
Yeah.
Amazing
He's
horse,
the
what he
best
used to do.
miler. Won a Cox Plate, ran in Melbourne
Ran
Cups.
second in a Melbourne Cup.
And like, you know,
He was a
just-
miler. He really
and
was
you,
a
you look
miler.
at Dulcify. You ever seen
Dulcify was a good one.
Jeez. And Manicato. Manicato, you know.
Manicato, that was a
I
horse,
probably
mate.
never
Yeah.
seen it, but Manicato was a Golden Slipper winner. There he was, carrying my money in an Australian Cup, length and a half in front.
That's right.
Golden Slipper winner. And then got beat a length. I said, use
But
better.
what
I
beat
said,
him?
how did that happen?
What
Dulcify.
Dulcify beat him. Dulcify come like a rocket that day.
Aye.
It was home Manicato. Geez, it was a racehorse.
While I think that the jockeys and the trainers and they're comparable with the greats, I don't know whether the horses are as good, whether I was closer to the horses then, but you know, there seem to be more better horses then. The best now, and particularly mares, something's happened with mares over the last 25 years.
Yeah.
They've expanded
The mares,
incredibly.
I said it, in all the sports in the world, there's only one sport where the mares are as good,
Yes.
and that's horse racing.
Yeah, and
Also females are as good.
And not only horse, horse and human.
But what I mean, but females are the best, just as good. Like any other sport, men dominate, right? The thing that the mares have an advantage on is the fact that they get that 2 kilo
You'll say they
advantage.
should.
Well, maybe so they should, but we both think starting to agree.
But once
are
upon a
they
time-
just as good?
But once upon a time they weren't.
They weren't,
Once
but
upon
now
a
they
time-
are. I think they're
once
just as
upon
good,
a time-
and they're getting the.
Once upon a time, they were the weak agenda, both on horse and human.
Yeah.
But you have a look at it now,
Jamie Carr, she's
Yeah.
as good
A
as
lot of them will
anyone.
say that she's as good as J-Mac. I wouldn't say that myself, but some would. But she's very, very good. Rachel King is very good. Kathy O'Hara rides a lot of winners. We've got a lot of these young apprentices coming up, and
You look
the
at the-
game has changed. What would if
But the last 5 great horses of Australia, though, are Winx, Black Caviar, So You Think He's a Boy,
Mackay.
Sunline, and Mackay Diva.
Yeah.
Well, I don't.
They're the last 5 great
And
ones
Mighten
in the last 20 years.
Power.
Well, it's before that.
I
So the last
can't,
20 years, you go back to 90s.
Okay,
Yeah, then Mighten Power.
Yeah.
And then you've got to go back
Sure,
to probably.
yeah.
Well,
I
Kingston
you
Town
see,
and
that's what I
Better
say.
Listen
I
Up, isn't
can't
it?
give. I condemn myself. I just can't give Might and Power up there.
Okay.
But a great
Yeah.
horse.
The day he won the Caulfield Cup, no horse in the world
Yeah,
would
but
have
he had
beat him that
50.
day.
He had 51, 52
Yeah.
in his back.
And then
But
he
he
went
was-
up 4
1.8
kilos.
He wasn't consistent enough. He was a brilliant mind power, but he wasn't consistent enough.
Oh, he's
I
pretty
don't know.
consistent.
He got beat quite a few times. Like, not when you line it up against what Winx did. And Sunline was pretty inconsistent. Well,
Yeah,
Sunline
but
got
Winx
beat
was
a
a
lot.
different
Hey,
sort of
Adam,
horse,
tell him
mate.
about the weight for. Weeks was running in weight for age races.
That's
mate.
right.
He's weight. Might and Power. Look,
Might
it's a
Power's
personal
winning
thing.
handicaps, mate.
Yeah, but weight for age is pretty hard to win too.
Hey,
No, it's
tell
not.
him.
It suits the best horse.
I'm a
Not when you're
huge
the
mind
best
power
horse,
fan.
it's
I'm just
not.
saying that he's when you look at his career, it's a little bit dented compared to your Winx's.
Well, they're different
even
sort
your
of
Mackay
horses,
Divas
mate.
and stuff.
One
It
was,
just-
one was a
wasn't-
1.5 mile, 2 mile horse.
See,
Mine-
mate, you're using the word dented, but the old horses, they had to get out of their comfort zone.
That's right.
They
had
don't
to.
today.
That's right. They don't. They've got
They
to match.
don't
It's all
today.
set up for
Sure,
the weight for age
sure.
stuff.
You'd
Yeah,
never,
yeah,
probably
yeah.
never a horse like Sky High wouldn't come into your equation. Sky High won a golden slipper and a good golden slipper. Sky High won a Derby.
One at AJC
And
Derby as
Sky
well.
High was favourite for a Melbourne Cup and had about 9 stone 9. And they had to do that. And he was a dead set, probably a mile. I don't know how many Group 1s he won. People, you don't think of them, but they were great horses. Great horses.
Yeah, like Kingston Town when you ran second, we had 59 kilos that day. Mackay Diva had 58 when she won her third.
Yeah.
So he had to carry a kilo more. If he had 58, he wins the cup. You know, I'm just, carrying weight, giving horses weight. We see the luxury Winx, not detracting from Winx, her and Kingston are the best 2 horses I've ever seen. But she never had a race where she had to give the entire field weight.
Yeah. Yeah.
She was always
Yeah,
getting
that's
weight.
it.
She got 2 kilos off that thing, Red Excitement, the day she beat Red Excitement with that match. She got 2 kilos off Red Excitement. Are you serious? How's he giving her 2 kilos?
Yeah, definitely
This
would
weight
help.
for age system,
Yeah,
though.
but you
it
look at-
suits the best horse.
Gunsynd.
Gunsynd.
Gunsynd. Look what he did with it over a mile. And did it carrying huge weight.
Huge.
They said Gunsynd couldn't stay 2 miles. He had 9 stone 8.
Which
he
is-
was 3 and 4 wide
how much
all
is
the way
60?
in the Melbourne Cup.
Yes.
He got beat by Piping Lane. Had 7 stone 8. Got beat a length and a half. How well would he have got him 2 miles with about 8 stone?
That's
7?
right. Yeah. Take some weight off their back and say, here you go. Yeah.
Last question, Max. Who are some of the great journalists you've worked with in the way that they've used words and stuff in their articles and things like that?
Oh, well, I think there's any good writer can write a good racing story. And you talk about good racing stories like Les Carline's, which are beautiful racing stories. But, when I think of the great people that I've been fortunate enough to be working around, like Bert Lilly, and a lot of different style of writers like Keith Robbins, I think you mentioned there. Keith was a reporter. He wasn't a writer, but to get the news. There were just so many. In Melbourne, Jack Elliott. And Jack Elliott wasn't a Les Carline either. But when you saw Jack work on a Melbourne Cup and the speed at which they worked. Now, the Melbourne Cup was run at 2:40, so the Melbourne Herald could be out on the street at 4:30 outside of Spencer Street Station, and it was.
Yeah.
And you could pick up, it was an art form, the Melbourne Herald. After a Melbourne Cup at 4:30, there was everything you wanted to know about, every big bet, every jockey comment. That was journalism at speed.
Yeah.
I'm an old tabloid hack. I appreciate that more so. There's beautiful riders and many beautiful riders. Andrew Rule now is a wonderful rider on racing. They're all good, but they're not racing riders. They're riders that write well about racing. But when I think of the Burt Lillys and the Jack Elliots and some of the Jack Schofields, the men of my time, and if you really want to get into the nitty gritty, the Pat Farrells, the Frank Browns.
Pat Farrell, remember Pat Farrell as a kid.
And
Did he have a patch on his eye in the article in the
No,
paper?
no.
They didn't have some photo with him, a thing over his eye, Pat Farrell or something? Or
he,
Sitting Pat?
Great story about Sitting Pat.
Sitting Pat.
He, I think it was Melbourne Mick. He had a very bad night at the trots, the dogs. And they were trying to find out, oh, well, Mick, well, Pat, he said, no, yes, well, I'm just ringing you up. It's Saturday morning. I know I've had a bad night. I haven't tallied it up yet. And Mick said, well, yes, Pat, you had a bad night. It's not like you to be betting that big. Yeah, no. Look, were you putting money on for anybody? Was anybody else to buy? Oh, yes, he said, somebody else was to buy. He said, can you give me a name? Can you give me a name? He said, yes, sir. Having Jack Daniels. Jack Daniels. Boom.
Oh, right. Got it. Sorry, I was slow to get that one.
Mick wouldn't be giving him any names.
So that the booze was to blame. Very good. And what are the game's so different now when you started your career? Do you think we're in good shape?
Yeah. No, the game's different now. Unfortunately, racing's not one of the biggest games in town. It still is. But it's not appreciated as one of the great big... Look, racing today has got many... It's never been stronger in certain aspects. We've been talking about the SP bookies and the money then. But when you look at the owners in racing today, in Jack Sparrow's time, there might have been... The racehorses were owned by landed gentry.
Yeah.
Colourful racing personalities.
That's right.
A few businessmen, maybe a few legal giants. Now, when you look at the thousands that are in syndicates...
The syndicates, yeah. There was no syndicates then.
And at the races on Saturday, the Millennium, the mounting enclosure, it was packed like sardines with people that owned a share in a horse.
They owned the tail.
Now,
yeah.
40, 50 years ago, that wasn't the case. And you look at the business that the big bookies are doing today, the clients that they've got. Well, they've absorbed all that SP money and everything like. Alas, it's not the same at the track. It's sad that the track. I'll always go to the track while I can. The betting ring, once upon a time, was a 3-ring circus. You look at it now, but I still reckon you can get the best price. If you shop around, a mug punter like me shops around, you'll get a better price. The betting ring at Randwick or Rosehill than you will off the corporate. Well, the prices they put up the board. I don't know whether
You do. You're 100% right. You do get a better price at the track.
It's still there. Racing is still there. It's a wonderful industry, wonderful sport, wonderful pastime. Never been a job to me. It's a way of life.
Yeah.
It's a way of life.
Yeah. Well, that's a great way to finish. Thank you, boys.
Cheers. It's been fun.
I'm sure we've a lot of people will learn a lot about the great game.
The history.
So, yeah.
You got to know about the history.
Max, thank you very much for taking time to come and talk to us.
Nah, my pleasure.
Adam, thank you very
Max.
much.
Thank you,
and
Richie.
we'll roll on. Cheers, boys.
Cheers. Thank you.
Well done. That was